In this part of the module, we will focus on trajectory segmentation and simplification. The idea is quite simple. So we might have raw trajectories, which often contain huge amount of data. But for the analysis, we do not need this level of detail. So here, segmentation means that we split a trajectory into meaningful parts, for example, by separating different movement behaviors or activities. Simplification means that we reduce the number of points while still preserving the essential shape of the trajectory. Both are important pre-processing steps. They make it easier to analyze trajectories, to reduce the storage requirements, and to help us to focus on the most relevant aspects of the movement. In order to segment a trajectory, we analyze it with regard to different subparts of it. Those subparts can be also called a sub-trajectory or a trajectory segment or simply part of the trajectory. For example, we want to extract different activities of a moving object. Those activities do not extend over the whole trajectory, but there might be even more activities in this trajectory, like shown in this example on top. Here you will also find different activities like shown in these windows here. So the idea is that the trajectory has to be segmented first to separate relevant from irrelevant movement data. For example, a person's movement through a day may contain different activities like walking, waiting, taking a bus or running, and then those activities are somehow mixed in a single trajectory. So we have to first separate them in order to analyze it. The question is how to define those segments. This is highly context dependent. In some cases you need domain experts to define the rules, but in general the idea is that within a segment the movement characteristics are relatively uniform. Examples of such characteristics include speed, heading, altitude, or sinuosity. So when one of those attributes changes significantly, that's a good indicator that a new segment begins. There are many different approaches to segment, and we will look now to some well-known methods. One important approach to trajectory segmentation was introduced by Buchin and colleagues. The idea is to use attribute functions to describe different movement characteristics along a trajectory. For example, you can compute the speed at every point or the heading, or more complex measures such as curvature or sinuosity. If you plot these values over time, hour or distance, you get functions that describe how the movement attribute changes. The central idea is now that a trajectory should be split into segments whenever the variation within an attribute becomes too large. For instance, if within a part of the trajectory the speed values vary only slightly, we can treat it as one homogeneous segment. But if the speed suddenly changes a lot, that is an indication that a new segment should start. To make this robust, the method does not work with fixed thresholds, but with relative values. It looks at the maximum speed of the attribute in relation to the segment. This avoids over-segmentation in noisy data and under-segmentation in complex trajectories. For the actual implementation, different algorithms can be used. A simple one could be the greedy algorithm, which iteratively searches for places where the speed exceeds a given limit and then cuts a trajectory at those places. The result of this approach is a trajectory divided into a small number of segments, where each segment is relatively homogeneous in terms of movement characteristics. This makes it much easier to identify phases of behavior, for example, periods of steady walking, phases of acceleration, or movements of irregular movement. A different approach is proposed by Anagnostopoulos and colleagues. Here, the idea is to approximate a trajectory by enclosing parts of it in minimum bounding boxes. A bounding box is the smallest rectangle that fully contains a part of the trajectory. The segmentation is then guided by a cost function. Typically, the cost function is defined as the sum of the volumes or areas of all bounding boxes. The goal is to minimize the cost while still covering the entire trajectory. So if a trajectory makes a sharp turn, the bounding box covering that area becomes inefficient. Its area or volume becomes much larger compared to the actual path. At that point, the algorithm decides to split the trajectory into segments, each with its own bounding box. This way, the segmentation adapts automatically to the geometry of the trajectory. The result is a simplified representation of the movement, broken into a small number of segments that are easier to manage and store. The method is especially useful in applications where storage retrieval or database indexing plays a major role. Instead of storing every individual trajectory point, we can represent movement in terms of compact geometric primitives, the bounding boxes that still capture the essential structure. Further, we can also use the Douglas-Polka algorithm, which was part of one of the first modules in this course, not for simplification, but also for segmentation here. Usually we want to do simplification, so we want to get rid of some points within the trajectory, but here we can also use it for segmentation purposes. This Douglas-Polka algorithm starts with the two endpoints of the trajectory segment. So we will have this trajectory, this example trajectory, and it will start with the two endpoints of the trajectory segment. So this point and this point. Then it will look for intermediate points and finds the one that lies farthest away from the straight line and between the endpoints. So in this case, this will be this point. And in addition, this point has to be outside the so-called tolerance epsilon value, so which is a tolerance threshold here in this case. So if there is a point outside, we will keep it. So in this case, we will keep this point. Then the algorithm continues recursively with the remaining segments. So in this case, we will create again a start. We will take a starting point, the first point, and this new breakpoint here. And again, we will connect it with a straight line and check the intermediate points to be inside or outside of the threshold. In this case, there is no point outside, so which means we will remove all the points in the segment. On the other side, we again take the breakpoint as first point and the last point of the trajectory as endpoint. We will just connect it again with a straight line and find the points which are outside of the threshold. Again, here we will again find one point which is farthest away, and we will take this point as an additional breakpoint. Now, again, we will do with this new segment recursively the same as before, which means we will connect, or we would connect the two breakpoints with a straight line, apply the threshold again, and would check if the intermediate points are outside or inside the threshold. In this case, both are inside. So we can eliminate them. Then we will do it for the last segment as well. So we take the second breakpoint and the originally last point of the trajectory and apply the threshold and check the intermediate points. There is no intermediate point, so we are done with this trajectory. So the final result looks like shown here. So we will have the first segment, which is starting from the originally first point of the trajectory to the first breakpoint. Then there's a segment starting from the first breakpoint to the second breakpoint. And we will have the last segment, which is from second breakpoint to the last point of the trajectory. So in this case, we have nice cutting points for cutting the trajectory. We can transfer them to the original trajectory here. So we will cut our trajectory here, and we would cut it here. And of course, at the same time, we also have a simplified version of the trajectory, which is more or less following the similar geometry or shape of the trajectory, but of course has far less points.